We will continue our look at the Cold War by considering some early Cold War hotspots in China and Korea, the destructive nature of atomic weapons, and a growing arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union, the election of the young senator from Massachusetts in 1960, and end with Cold War flashpoints on the little island of Cuba. It's Cold War Part 2. Throughout the 1930s and into World War II, China faced Japanese aggression as Japan attempted to expand. After the war, there was a civil war in China between Chinese nationalists and communist forces. The United States supported the nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek, who was fiercely opposed by communist forces led by Mao Zedong, who had gained the support of the millions of poor peasants in China. In spite of aid from the United States, Chiang Kai-shek was defeated, and China was recreated as the People's Republic of China in May 1949 as a communist country. Chiang Kai-shek fled to the island of Formosa and established the Republic of China at what became Taiwan, which you can see right there. The United States would recognize this, Taiwan, as the official government of China until the 1970s. And ultimately, what the Chinese Civil War will show is it will increase American fears of communist domination over most of the world that we will see throughout the Cold War. Korea was another country in Asia who would face Japanese expansionary aggression in the years leading up to World War II. But after the war, Japanese troops in Korea surrendered to Soviet forces in the north and American forces in the south. This led to Korea being divided at the 38th parallel. And on June 25, 1950, North Korean forces launched an attack on the south in an attempt to take over the peninsula. The North Korean army was supplied by the Soviet Union. They had Soviet tanks, planes, and money, but there were no Soviet troops involved. A desperate South Korea sought support from the UN, who sent more than 500,000 troops, along with Douglas MacArthur, as the head of UN forces. It's important to understand that 90% of the troops sent to Korea as part of this UN force were actually American. Before MacArthur arrived, South Korea was almost pushed off the peninsula, but MacArthur's arrival at Incheon led to North Korea being pushed back across the 38th parallel to the Yalu River, which is the border between China and Korea. In response to UN forces at its doorstep, China sent 300,000 troops into Korea. So on the Korean Peninsula in 1950, you have South Korean and United Nations forces, which was primarily American, fighting South Korean and Chinese forces, who were supplied by the Soviet Union. MacArthur began calling for a nuclear attack on China, an idea President Truman, the commander-in-chief of the military, disagreed with. MacArthur then proceeded to publicly criticize the president, his superior, and was fired during the war. By July 1951, a ceasefire was signed between North and South Korea, and a demilitarized zone, or the DMZ, was created between the two countries. There was no treaty, thus technically North and South Korea are still at war, and they both currently have troops on the border with weapons aimed at each other. And there have been instances of conflict between the two sides since the end of the Korean War. Combat officially came to an end in July 1953. Communism had been contained, which was the stated goal of American foreign policy at the time, but it still existed in the North. 54,000 Americans died in a war that is known by many as the Forgotten War, because it is that war that took place between World War II and Vietnam. The picture there is of the Vietnam Memorial in D.C., well worth your time. The first and only time nuclear weapons had been used is when the United States used the atomic bomb to end the war with Japan. In response, the Soviet Union began developing a bomb of its own. And in 1949, the Soviet Union joined the United States as a country with the nuclear option. What ensued was a nuclear arms race where both countries were working tirelessly to create the next most destructive weapon. The questions were, who could develop more weapons and who could create the most powerful weapon? And in November 1952, the United States tested the first hydrogen bomb. The hydrogen bomb would make the atomic bomb look like a firecracker. In August of 1953, the Soviets tested their own H-bomb. Dwight Eisenhower, the hero of D-Day during World War II, was elected president in 1952, and he and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, were committed to doing everything necessary to stop the spread of communism, including using the nuclear option. Brinksmanship was the idea of going right up to the brink of war to get what they wanted, so the United States dramatically increased the size of its Air Force and nuclear arsenal under Eisenhower. Massive retaliation was the idea that if one side was attacked, the other would respond in kind with just as much power or even more. Eisenhower believed that massive retaliation was the way to prevent the Soviet Union from using their nuclear weapons. If they believed that the attack was going to be so big, they would not use weapons of their own. Another term for this is mutually assured destruction. And it was the fear of nuclear war that was a constant source of anxiety for Americans for the next 30 years. During the Cold War, foreign policy issues were far and away the most important issues in any presidential campaign. Virginia benefited from this emphasis and the increased military spending during the Cold War. In the Hampton Roads area, there are significant naval and air bases that are very relevant to the defense of the United States, and they employ thousands of people in the Hampton Roads area. The Pentagon in D.C. is where much military planning takes place and where many military contractors are employed, which drives money into the suburbs of Northern Virginia. In 1960, Vice President Richard Nixon and Massachusetts Senator John Kennedy faced off for the presidency. Kennedy was only the second major party candidate to run for president as a Catholic, and his narrow victory over Nixon in 1960 made him the first and only Catholic president of the United States. And in his inaugural address, JFK made it clear where he stood on the Cold War, saying that the United States would pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, in order to assure the survival and success of liberty. In his inaugural address, he also offered a challenge to the American people to get involved and be active, and he said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." And unlike his predecessor, Kennedy wanted a military policy with options, and that was not dependent on nuclear weapons. This was known as the flexible response. It increased the number of non-nuclear weapons the United States had and would allow the United States to intervene in other countries if needed. It would be 3 years later that the first U.S. combat troops would make their way to Vietnam. Between 1956 and 1959, Fidel Castro launched a revolution against the Fulgencio Batista government in Cuba. Castro created a communist country in Cuba only 90 miles from the coast of Florida. Once in power, Castro undermined American business interests in Cuba. He received a significant amount of aid from the Soviet Union, and he repressed the rights of any political opponents on the island. And it was in Cuba where John F. Kennedy would face immediate challenges through the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis. The first of these events was the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was a planned attack on Cuba. This was started under the Eisenhower administration, and in March 1960, the CIA began training an army of anti-Castro Cuban exiles. The idea behind the invasion was that once the people in Cuba saw anti-Castro forces on their shores, they would eventually join in the revolution and overthrow Castro. The attack was a disaster from the beginning. There were coordination issues, and there was the uprising that they expected to happen never took place. Once the forces were trapped on the beach, the Kennedy administration decided not to send in U.S. forces to save them. Castro used the failed invasion to get even more aid from the Soviet Union and to strengthen his power in Cuba. And this really was an embarrassment for the new president of the United States and a victory for Fidel Castro. Shortly after the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev became the new leader of the Soviet Union. And one of the things that Khrushchev vowed to do was to defend the island of Cuba with Soviet weapons if necessary. And on October 14, 1962, the United States revealed that their intelligence sources had determined that the Soviet Union had been putting missiles in Cuba, and some argued that these missiles were ready to launch. So we would have nuclear weapons 90 miles off the coast of the United States at the ready. And let's close the show by looking at the American response to these developments and the results of the Cuban Missile Crisis. On October 22nd, 1962, President Kennedy went on TV and said that any attack would result in an all-out war between the United States and the Soviet Union. He also announced that he was establishing a naval blockade of Cuba until these weapons were removed. And the world watched as the two superpowers stared each other down, and a full-scale nuclear war seemed like a real possibility. The United States had 100,000 troops assembled, ready to go in Florida, and when Soviet ships reached the blockade, they stopped. And eventually, Khrushchev blinked, agreeing to remove the missiles in exchange for President Kennedy's pledge not to invade the island of Cuba. In a separate secret agreement that was not revealed to the public, the United States also agreed to remove its own missile sites in Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis was over, but it was the closest the world would come to nuclear war. Luckily, the powers that be worked out these differences. But there was still plenty of tension to go around. We will look at the American experience in Vietnam next time. And until then, good night, Albuquerque.